G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Today's rear vision is going to explain to us what went wrong with Australia's environmental protection legislation and how the busyness as usual lobby has managed to modify the regulations, change the legislation, shift the goalposts and trash the ecology of the biosphere. Hoorah!
And in this rear vision, the environment and how we failed to protect it.
Everyone agrees that it's the biggest rewrite of federal environmental laws in a quarter of a century. The Minister, Robert Hill, describes it as a long overdue codification of the Commonwealth's powers on the environment. Environmental groups, though, say that it hands all power back to the states, putting Dracula in charge of the blood bank. Gone are the Commonwealth triggers to stop Wesleydale, Franklin Dam or sand mining on Fraser Island. And there are over 80 other good reasons why they say the bill must be stopped.
An ABC report on the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which became law under the Howard government with the support of the Democrats in the Senate in 2000. Australia is home to plants and animals found nowhere else on the planet, and we have many environmental treasures recognised on UNESCO's World Heritage List. 20 years ago, this law was passed to protect our rich heritage, especially important as we'd signed up to international laws that obliged us to do just that. Embedded in that law was a trigger that required a review every 10 years. The second of these has just been completed, and like the first one 10 years ago, it's found that the law has been a failure.
Australia currently has the worst rate of mammal extinction anywhere in the world, and we are also a declared global deforestation hotspot. So a couple of years ago, WWF International put out a report that listed the worst deforestation hotspots in the world. I think there were 11. Australia was the only developed country on that list.
Leslie Hughes, a professor of biology at Macquarie Uni. The Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act was passed in 1999 and came into effect the following year. Not all environmental groups were happy, but some thought a less than perfect bill was better than no bill at all. James Pittock, now an environmental scientist at the ANU, was working for the World Wildlife Fund at the time.
The incoming Howard government in 1996 had made some good efforts to engage with environmental organisations. My key concerns were that there were many environmental agreements, international agreements that Australia had signed on to that weren't given effect in national law, and that meant that the federal government wouldn't intervene where states were making poor decisions on the environment. On the flip side, I was concerned that the federal government in this new law might hand over responsibility for implementing these international agreements to the state governments without adequate checks and balances. And so that was at the heart of this discussion. There was one more major concern at the time, and this was whether or not the environmental impacts of logging operations would be included in the national law. And for environment groups, this was an iconic, still is an iconic industry. It had been 2 decades of environment wars, a lot of political confrontation on this, and neither side of politics were wanting to have federal government regulating logging operations. A number of the environment groups said, we want nirvana if this law is not perfect and includes federal regulation of logging operations, then we won't support it. My view and the view of other groups was that it would be very regrettable if logging operations weren't regulated, but if we got an improvement by having, the other 90 or more % of the country better protected, then that was a compromise worth accepting in the interim.
Since 1999, there have been amendments to the EPBC Act and a mandatory review at the first 10-year mark. Rachel Wormsley from the Environmental Defenders Office, an NGO.
Yeah, so in the last 20 years, the Act has been amended a number of times for different reasons, including amendments to address Great Barrier Reef, to address wildlife trade regulations, offshore petroleum, and a range of different miscellaneous amendments over the years. I think perhaps most notably in 2013, there was a water trigger introduced by Tony Windsor, and that's about the impacts of large coal and coal seam gas projects on water resources. The amendments have had varying degrees of influence over the years. The Act is required to be reviewed every 10 years. So in 2009, Alan Hawke did a very wide-ranging consultation and did an extensive interim report and final report with 71 recommendations. Now that first statutory review was pretty scathing about the first 10 years of the Act. It actually recommended a new Act be written. It did suggest streamlining, but it also suggested strengthening. Now, the 71 recommendations that the Hawke Review came up with, unfortunately, they never really saw the light of day. They've languished on a dusty departmental shelf, and no action was really taken to implement those amendments due to the politics in the years since. So now we're at the point, after 20 years, where we have the next 10-year statutory review underway, led by Graham Samuel, and he's finding many of the same problems that Alan Hawke identified 10 years ago. And all the amendments and all the bills over the years haven't really addressed the problems of the Act. So we now actually have over 1,000 pages of regulation in this Act, and it's well overdue for comprehensive reform and review.
The evidence seems plain to see.
We have an Act that doesn't prevent extinction, even though that is the primary national act to conserve our unique biodiversity. In the last 10 years, we've seen our first mammal species go extinct because of climate change, and there was nothing the Act could do to stop that. Studies have found that 7.7 million hectares of potential habitat has been cleared since 2000. And of all this clearing, over 93% of this wasn't even referred to the federal government under the Act. If you look at the issues that the Act does cover, so World Heritage, our internationally important wetlands, Ramsar wetlands, even those are in a state of decline. If you look at the State of Environment reports, they say our biodiversity is in a state of decline with almost 2,000 listed species now. Our Great Barrier Reef is at risk. Our other World Heritage properties, such as the wet tropics in Tasmania, are at risk, and our wetlands are drying out. So if you look at the key things that the Act is supposed to protect, they're all on trajectories of decline. There have been about 6,500 projects referred under the Act in 20 years, but there's only ever been a handful of refusals, and the Act has been really ineffective in actually delivering environmental outcomes.
Why has the EPBC Act been such a failure?
One of its failings has been that it tends to apply to assessing individual threats to species and ecosystems, whereas we know that it is actually the cumulative impact of multiple threats that really affect things. So if we only deal with one threat at a time, rather than have an Act that is fit for purpose in dealing with multiple and cumulative impacts, then we will never actually have effective environmental protection. For example, let me just say hypothetically, if there's a species that is in a number of different populations, small populations spread across Australia, each of those populations is actually vulnerable, and the species is vulnerable because it's fragmented and the total population size is quite small, so it may end up on a threatened species list. But if the Act is applied, let's say a developer wants to develop in a particular place that threatens one population, then it might be considered that that's okay because it's only going to affect that small portion of the species distribution. But then we get other developments that might affect other populations. And if each of those is attacked and assessed independently, you know, it's the classic death by 1,000 cuts. You could lose the species because each of those threats have been assessed independently rather than at the same time.
One of the victims of this death by 1,000 cuts is the swift parrot.
There are fears the survival of the endangered swift parrot is being further compromised. Right to information documents have revealed evidence of the Environment Department approving logging in parrot breeding habitat despite strong scientific advice.
Its designation as an endangered species means that it is the closest to extinction of all the threatened species categories that we have.
When I first became aware of the swift parrot as a kid in the 1980s, they were already considered rare.
Sean Dooley from BirdLife Australia.
It's a beautiful bird, a small parrot, bright green with a red face, and they're the most migratory parrot in the world. They feed in the blue gum forests and breed nearby in old growth trees with tree hollows. And they're very selective about where they breed. They need the tree hollows in a certain species of tree that is near flowering blue gums. And because the blue gum flowering each season is intermittent, and some areas will have heavy flowering and others won't flower at all. So the swift parrot is a really tricky devil to preserve because they'll breed in one site and then not breed there again for another 5 or 6 years. They're one of the more difficult birds to conserve, and you need to conserve multiple sites to ensure that the population will survive. And when I first started birdwatching as a kid in the 80s, I remember around that time it said that there were maybe 8,000 birds, which was considered fairly rare. By the time the EPBC Act was implemented in 2000, they were already listed, I believe, as endangered, but back then it may have even been still only as vulnerable. However, in the 20 years since, the numbers of swift parrots have just continued to plummet, and currently we think that there may only be around 1,000 birds left in the wild. After the birds had bred in Tasmania, they migrate across Bass Strait into Victoria and then basically follow the eucalypt blossom, usually on the inland side of the divide in the box ironbark forests in particular. But in drought years, when those trees don't flower, the swift parrots have to move further afield. They will end up in places like coastal New South Wales, northern New South Wales, and even into Queensland. And one of the many problems with the EPBC Act protecting swift parrots is this extensive range that they have. But the way the EPBC Act currently works is they don't really take into consideration cumulative impacts. You see a bit of bush being cleared here that doesn't meet the criteria of having a significant impact, and a housing development there, or some logging in another site, and the lights go out for that bird across the landscape. But each incident isn't deemed serious enough. And so the swift parrot has been declining throughout the period of the EPBC Act, despite it being upgraded to critically endangered.
The swift parrot's plight is exacerbated by the fact that other agreements between federal and state governments can take precedence over the EPBC Act.
One of the biggest threats facing the swift parrot is the logging of its habitat, both in Tasmania, where to this day known nesting trees are still being logged, and also on the mainland, particularly in the south coast of New South Wales, where forests that the swift parrot uses as winter refuges are still open to logging. Now, because this is a critically endangered bird with maybe only around 1,000 left, those processes would be identified as threatening processes, and action should be taken to mitigate those threats. However, the Act also allows for other legislation to override the EPBC Act. So we have a series of regional forest agreements that the Commonwealth struck with the states, which actually gazump any action that can be taken by the EPBC Act. And as long as the states say that they're considering the impact of an endangered species like the swift parrot, then there is literally nothing that the EPBC Act can do to intervene to stop continued proven decline of the swift parrot due to logging of its breeding habitat.
listening to Radio National's Rear Vision with Kerry Phillips. We're looking at the troubled history of Australia's environmental law, the EPBC Act, currently going through its second mandatory review. Leslie Hughes says that other weaknesses come about from the way the law has been applied.
When a species or a population or an ecological community is put on a threatened list, there is supposed to be then a recovery plan written. Similarly, if a key threatening process, that is a threat to species, is listed, there is a threat abatement plan written. Now, in actual fact, what's happened is that we have many species and communities listed that don't have plans written at all. And then those plans that have been written, and we now have conservation advices, which are even shorter plans, there is no mechanism under the Act to ensure that the resources are made available to actually put the actions into place. So you could have a species listed, you could have a very good plan written with a whole lot of actions that, if implemented, could save that species. But there's no obligation under the Act for the actions in the recovery plan or conservation advice to actually be funded. The Act looks after the first part of the process, but it doesn't actually oblige the government to mandate the actions and to resource them effectively to mean that the species actually recovers.
Sean Dooley says well-resourced recovery plans can save threatened species.
We have several examples in Australia where that has worked, and it's worked spectacularly well. For instance, the Kangaroo Island glossy black cockatoo, a recovery plan was started in the 1990s, and since that recovery plan was implemented with the buy-in of government and the local community and the conservation community, the numbers of glossy black cockatoos had tripled in 20 years. An outstanding success for that magnificent species. But then, because it was successful, the funding was dropped, and basically there's been no recovery plan update since about 2005. Now, because of the fires on Kangaroo Island, which has wiped out a massive part of their habitat and killed a lot of those birds, there is going to be funding going back into it. But it just goes to show that recovery is a long-term process. Another clear example of this was a Norfolk Island green parrot, as it's known locally. It was only found on Norfolk Island, and that was critically endangered and on way to extinction in the 1980s. A recovery plan was implemented in the 1990s, and by the early 2000s, that species had bounced back spectacularly well. So well, in fact, that the vision for Norfolk Island shifted, and rather than focusing on that individual species, it became more of a regional plan. And so the eye was taken off the ball throughout the 2000s, and without that dedicated, resourced and focused action, the things that had saved the Norfolk Island parrot from extinction, which was predator control, the use of nest boxes, the preservation of nesting hollows, those sorts of things that were all successful, they stopped being done, and the population of the parrot plummeted again. And it was only identified by BirdLife Australia and on-ground conservationists on Norfolk Island and our partners, and we brought that to the attention of the Commonwealth, and we had to fight for the plan to be re-implemented. And action has been taken in the years since, and again the bird has bounced back. So we know that conservation actions work, but they have to be resourced, they have to be based on good data, based on good monitoring, and we just don't even get that for most of our threatened species. Currently, of the 71 threatened birds on the EPBC Act, only 6 of them have up-to-date recovery plans that are resourced. So that's only 8% of our threatened birds are actually being dealt with in the proper manner by the current legislation.
Soaring over concrete and rooftops, the bald eagles nesting in Philadelphia this year may provide the best evidence of all that America's bird is back. In the 1960s, there were only a few hundred bald eagles left. Now they are found across the country.
A CBS report from 2007, when the bald eagle, America's national bird, was removed from the list of endangered and threatened wildlife. The US Environment Protection Agency is an independent body set up by President Richard Nixon in 1970 to maintain and enforce national environmental standards. Suzanne Milthorpe from the Wilderness Society.
Under the Endangered Species Act, or the ESA, what we've got is these really strong thresholds that basically says once a species is endangered, you can't harm it and you can't harm its habitat or the places that it needs to survive, to breed, to feed, to thrive. And importantly, in that they define its habitat as not only the place that it needs to live now, but also the habitat that it needs to recover. So it's really proactively focused. And they've got these strong safeguards in law where you've basically got this really, really strong threshold, and then got the right under this act for communities actually to bring government to the table in cases where they don't want to enforce the act, and actually say to them, you know, we're going to take you to court to make sure you do your job. And so the combination of all these things have meant that the ESA has been remarkably successful, at least successful compared to the Australia's environment law, which has been an across-the-board failure. So in the United States, 90% of species are meeting their recovery milestones. So things are actually starting to recover as they should on time, which is really important. And it's estimated that 227 extinctions have been prevented, which is incredible compared with Australia, where you only really got one, or I think now two animals that have ever come off the EPBC because they've been recovered by conservation action. So you have a number that have come off because we've suddenly discovered that actually they're multiple species, or we discovered a bunch of them in a place we didn't know they were, so they were probably never endangered to begin with. There's actually only two that have really come off because we've stopped the threats to them and we've actually recovered them.
Australia enjoys the unhappy distinction of hosting the first mammalian extinction due to climate change. Last year, the federal government acknowledged the extinction of the Bramble Cay mellimus, a small brown rat that lived on a sand island at the northern tip of the Great Barrier Reef. Professor Martine Marin, an environmental scientist at the University of Queensland.
The Bramble Cay mellimus is perhaps the one that's most famous, and news of its demise went around the world. This was sadly probably the first loss due to climate change. The Bramble Cay mellimus occurred on a very low-lying island off northern Queensland. And unfortunately, with storm surges, sea level rise, the very last individual was lost from that island before we could take action to protect it. The Christmas Island pipistrelle, a small insect-eating bat, and the Christmas Island forest skink, both of these species disappeared also over the past decade or so. We knew about these species, we knew they were in trouble, but we didn't act in time, and so it's too late for them. But there are so many more species that are really on the brink that we can still act for, and we need coordinated national action to achieve. So island species are often especially vulnerable, and the three that I've just mentioned are all island species. The species that are in trouble on the mainland have been able to hang on longer, but for how much longer is the question. Species like the Regent honeyeater, that's a great example. It's a stunning black and gold honeyeater. It used to be common. People used to enjoy the sight of this bird in numbers right throughout eastern Australia. But now there are probably only a few hundred of those birds left, and you could probably speak to 1,000 people out in the street. Nobody would have seen one of these. So its loss to us has already occurred. The bird is still there, and so the efforts of organisations who are working hard to save it are so important. Unfortunately, every tree we put back, every bit of habitat we restore for this species is undone many times over by land clearing, by ongoing loss of habitat. And those are the sorts of situations that the Act has simply not been able to get a handle on.
The threat to Australia's unique environment comes not just from land clearing, but also from climate change, bushfire, introduced species like cats and foxes, and, according to the Samuel Review released last month, the lack of an effective law to protect it. An independent review into Australia's environmental protection laws has found that they are ineffective, complex and costly to business while providing little benefit to the environment itself.
The outcomes desired to be achieved by the Act in terms of environment protection and biodiversity conservation are simply not being achieved. We're seeing our environment in a state of steady decline over the 20 years since the Act has been in operation. It not only doesn't achieve its environmental outcomes, but it impedes appropriate, and I mean appropriate, business development.
The federal government is currently considering the Samuel Review's interim report, but it's already ruled out setting up an independent agency to monitor the law.
What's come out of the Minister's office thus far is all about streamlining process to make it quicker for developers to get approvals through. There's been nothing about actually turning around the decline of Australia's environment. So what we are all concerned with is that the government will cherry pick those recommendations that they can use to make things easier for developments to take place, which will actually give us worse environmental conditions than before. So, we're worried that the way this government is talking and has been dealing with environmental issues over the last decade, that things could actually get worse rather than get better. If, on the other hand, the government took on board the fact that Australia's environment is declining, as has been pointed out in every single State of the Environment report that's ever been done, and actually put into place the recommendations to turn that around, then that would be great. At the moment, we are not seeing any indications of that at all.
Changing environment laws is very risky, because if you open up the environment laws, there is the hope that they might be improved, but there are also many parts of Australian society that would like them weakened. Current Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act should be improved in a number of ways. One is that there should be the addition of more proactive conservation measures, things like regional plans that identify areas to protect and areas where development can proceed. They might include things like funding for managers of environmentally significant land. I think the laws should have stronger national standards, and that the expectation is that state governments should change their laws to match a stronger national standard. We need better information systems so that it is clearer to everybody where the places are of environmental importance that should be left alone versus those where development activities should occur. There's a need for more matters of national environmental significance to control things like the clearing of native vegetation. Australia is one of the top 5 countries undertaking deforestation in the world. It's because we should be able to better regulate more matters of national environmental significance.
After further consultation, Professor Samuel will publish a final report in October. Thanks to guests, Professor James Pittock from the Fenner School of Environment and Society at the ANU, Leslie Hughes, Distinguished Professor of Biology and Pro-Vice-Chancellor at Macquarie University, Sean Dooley, National Public Affairs Manager at BirdLife Australia, Professor Martine Marin, an environmental scientist at the University of Queensland, Rachel Wormsley, Director of Policy and Law Reform at the Environmental Defenders Office, and Suzanne Milthorpe, National Laws Campaign Manager with the Wilderness Society. Simon Branthwaite is the sound engineer for this Rear Vision. Bye from Kerry Phillips.
Yeah, that's pretty much the way I recall it all occurring. Once upon a time, if you saw a logging operation or a mining operation commencing or underway, which you were pretty sure it was contrary to Section Tiddly-Pom of Thou Shalt Not Desecrate the Environment Act, and we did have such acts, you were at liberty just sit in the middle of the road and block the entrance to such a site, while one of your mates or your family members hot-footed it to town, went to the local courthouse, and back in those days there used to be a chamber magistrate, a clerk of the court and a secretary, all employed 9 to 5 Monday to Friday in the courthouse. So you could go there during business hours and you could get the paperwork to get on the phone to Sydney, to fax it to Sydney. You could lodge an application for an urgent interim injunction in the New South Wales Land and Environment Court, alleging that the law was being broken. And that would cause, the mere application would cause all work to stop until the application for an urgent injunction had been heard. And if the urgent injunction was granted, which back in the 70s and 80s and early 90s it quite often was, because nobody wanted to crank this whole system up for a false alarm, then the operation had to stop until there was a full hearing into the matter. And quite often the loggers and the miners and the land developers and real estate agents, they got thrown out, because what they were attempting to do was to trash the environment quick before anybody noticed. Then, 1996, the environment lobby was told that there was going to be a strict census taken of all natural resources, trees, minerals, water, all that. And they're going to figure out how you could sustainably log the place and give the industry 10 years worth of guaranteed access to resources without trashing the environment, without killing any of the endangered species. The environmentalists went along with that process. It took 2 years to get there. I think it was 3 months, it might have been 6 months, it might have been 1 month. Immediately, shortly before the whole thing was put into law, voted on in Parliament, then gazetted, the time scale on which the industry was to have, quote, guaranteed access to resources was just magically doubled from 10 years to 20 years. So all the environmental buffer areas, everything that was necessary to keep the critters safe, to keep the plant species safe for that matter, that all went out the window and into the maws of the logging industry, which at the time was selling a lot of wood chips for cardboard packaging going into Asia. And at the same time, they changed the law in terms of who is seen to have standing in the Land and Environment Court. Whereas once upon a time, a third party, that is somebody who was walking slowly past an environmental disaster, as a citizen of the nation was seen to have standing in the Land and Environment Court and was therefore permitted to lodge a complaint. Oh no, after 1996, when the RAC Act came in, the only people who had standing in the Land and Environment Court was the landowner, the plant operator who was accused of doing the wrong thing, and the National Parks and Wildlife Service, who was charged with protecting all things endangered. But the Parks and Wildlife Service had been defunded, so they didn't have enough rangers to look after their own parks. They certainly didn't have any rangers to run around in the state forests to see what the logging industry was doing to critically endangered habitat. It got so that only way the national parks ever got to hear about anything was when private citizens went for a walk in the state forest, noticed something and complained to Parks and Wildlife. I know of one person who got so good at that that eventually he was declared to be a vexatious litigant in the Land and Environment Court, or by Parks and Wildlife and the Forestry Commission, I think. They said basically because of his long history of making complaints, which all turned out to be verified, therefore they weren't going to take any more complaints from him because he obviously had an agenda. Now, Scott Morrison, the dullard of Australia, he's put us on notice that he's drawing up plans for a legislation which would require that all development applications be finalised, and the assumption is that the finalised means approved, within 3 months of the development application being lodged, which means there won't be any time for anybody to conduct any environmental impact statement or survey or write a report or an analysis. And that's particularly juicy because he's also defunded the Department of Environment, so that there are no bureaucrats who have any experience, but there's no bureaucrats there anyway, to process the applications. And that's why there's a backlog of applications, and that's why he's able to say, oh, look, there's a big backlog of applications, there must be too much red tape and green tape, we're just going to slash all of that restrictive regulatory legislation and regulation, and we're going to let the developers have at it. For 250 years since the British first showed up here and Captain Cook shot the first Aborigine he ever encountered, the theory is that the business as usual lobby of the Chamber of Commerce gets whatever it wants, and the environment has all of the shitty stuff that the business as usual lobby can't find a way to make a profit from. So that's why your national parks are in areas that used to be really remote, but now there's nothing left anywhere else, so therefore they have to be opened up for logging and mining and city pricks to run around with guns shooting at things. And there's no money from the taxpayer to fund the National Parks and Wildlife Service because, you know, like to be a ranger there, you had to have a bloody degree in biology. You had to go to university and know what you were talking about. Shit, we can't have people who know what they're talking about. Not running government. Not in Australia. Not in Australia. It's a funny thing. Totally off topic, but I've been meaning to talk about this one for a while. Might as well do it now while the camera's hot and running. In Australia, we have a COVID outbreak in Melbourne and Victoria, and to a smaller degree in Sydney. I was wondering, why is it that everywhere else in Australia the population is actually paying attention to the social distancing, social isolation, self-quarantine type restrictions, but down in Melbourne and in the western suburbs of Sydney, there's a lot of people who just don't seem to think that it matters, not taking it seriously, to the degree where in Melbourne 10,000 people refused to be tested for COVID, despite living in a hotspot and being asked, can we test you? Oh, no, I don't believe in that, go away. 80% of the people who had been tested and were waiting for their test results and had been told to self-isolate, they weren't self-isolating, they were just going on with their lives because, you know, I haven't got a positive result back yet, so why should I take any precautions? And between 20 and 30%, depending on the day it was done, 20 to 30% of the people in Victoria and Melbourne who had been tested positive with corona, they weren't sick enough to go to hospital, they'd been told to self-isolate, they weren't at home when the army and the police went door knocking, some of them twice in one day. Why is it that so many of the people in Melbourne and Victoria don't take corona seriously? On the Victorian border with other states, vast numbers of people who live on the border, oh boo-hoo, why should we have to be self-isolating and putting up with restrictions? It's all happening away there in the city. Just because 75% of infected people test positive at the end of a week doesn't mean the incubating period is a week. The effective incubation period is closer to 3 weeks, because the absolute record is 38 days. There are about 2.5 to 5% of the people who are going to test positive for COVID-19 who won't test positive until day 21 or 22. And they will have been infected from day 15. perhaps from day 5. Nobody out here in regional Australia has any idea how far people have been travelling in the past 3 weeks before they got here to sneeze on us. But in Melbourne, that's the ground zero central for an outfit called Sky News, which is the Australian clone of Fox Entertainment. It's where the extreme non-science, i.e. nonsense, ultra-right-wing, neo-fascist capitalists gravitate to when they get kicked out of government or the sports, quote, industry, unquote, for being too much of an extremist. They go to Sky News, and the people in Melbourne have had them in their environment. I think first it was a cable TV or a satellite network, and now I see it on YouTube. I was stupid enough to have told YouTube how old I am and what my postcode is, and that I live on my own. Since then, my news feed has been absolutely choked with Sky News items. I used to get BBC, Channel 4, Guardian, AAP, ABC, MSNBC, CBC, all Australian Broadcasting Commission, SBS. I got a slice of world news now because I'm a 59-year-old man living on his own in rural New South Wales. YouTube's algorithm thinks I like Sky News. I didn't realise what a fucking bunch of dickheads Sky News was. But I think the reason why people in Victoria in general and Melbourne in particular have such a trumple-tardy Fox Entertainment adjusted view of the universe is because Sky News. Sky News is COVID-19's 5th column, turning Australians too stupid to pay attention. Just simple barrier nursing principles by which you can stop the virus in its tracks. But they don't want to do that. They don't want to believe that it's real. They think they're God's finest flowering of life on the planet, and there can't be any virus that's going to come for them. Just ask Peter Credlin or Andrew Bolt. Only 2 of them that I've watched enough or heard of enough to be able to name off the top of my head. But anyway, yep. As far as they're concerned, frogs and ducks can't fucking vote, so they don't care what happens in the environment. Problem of too many generations conceived and raised and bred in the cities, disconnected from the forces of reality, nature. So yeah, you notice they mentioned that we lost a bat species, one of the pipistrelles. When that one became extinct, that was when the ones that live here and come and camp with me became critically endangered. But that's how it was done. That's why these days you don't get greenies chaining themselves to bulldozers or camping in trees or anything like that, because you can't do it anymore. You don't achieve anything. All you do is get sent a personal bill for the calculated cost to the company of your interference with their projected operations. You're going to lose your house by going and trying to save a tree in the state forest. And the bat eaters lament virus is coming to get all of the fucking people who've voted for the last 30 to 60 years to go full steam ahead with all such regulation and legislation and perversion of the environmental protection laws to swing them around to favour development at all costs. If humanity had decided to care for the environment 40 years ago, we wouldn't be here where we are now. And the Chinese horseshoe bats wouldn't be wiping out sick old fat pricks and cunts. Because that's who's dying. The already sick, the old, the obese, and 2 dead men for every dead woman. I've been losing at elections for 41 years. And I have locally dwelling, critically endangered bats to camp out at my doorway and keep the Chinese bat eaters virus at bay if it does show up here. Isn't that lovely? I think it's great. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Best I could do. Ciao.